So hey, welcome to another episode of 10 with Tom. My name is Tom, and this is where we get to explore faith 10 minutes-ish at a time. Today I want to talk about dirty cups and the ugliness of hypocrisy. So it's so interesting to me that a survey done a few years ago of what views of non-Christians, people outside of the Christian faith, how they saw Christians. And the three top descriptors of Christians for those outside of faith were judgmental, homophobic, and hypocritical. Isn't that sad? I mean, we should be known for being loving and kind and gracious and tolerant, and yet we're known so often for being judgmental, homophobic, and hypocritical. And the number one actual kind of complaint was hypocrisy. You know, how Christians claim to have it right and get it wrong. And it's quite interesting because Jesus spoke a lot about this thing of hypocrisy. And he talks about in this specific passage that I want to look at today. I want to read quite a big chunk of scripture. I'm making up for Kerry's last week. No, I'm joking. You can cut that. But I want to read to you a big chunk of scripture today. It's from Matthew chapter 23. And I want to read the Message version because Jesus speaks to the religious leaders of the day. These guys were like the priests and the pastors of the day. And he has some pretty scathing things to say to them and about this sin of hypocrisy. Let me read it to you. I've had it with you. You're hopeless, you're religion scholars, you Pharisees, frauds. Your lives are roadblocks to God's kingdom. You refuse to enter and won't let anyone else in either. You're hopeless, you're religion scholars and Pharisees, frauds. You go halfway around the world to make a convert, but once you get him, you make him into a replica of yourselves, double damned. You're hopeless. What arrogant stupidity. You say, if someone makes a promise with his fingers crossed, that's nothing. But if he swears with his hand on the Bible, well, that's serious. What ignorance! Does the leather on the Bible carry more weight than the skin on your hands? And what about this piece of trivia? If you shake hands on a promise, that's nothing. But if you raise your hand, well, that God is your witness, that's serious. What ridiculous hair splitting. What difference does it make whether you shake hands or raise hands? A promise is a promise. What difference does it make if you make your promise inside or outside a house of worship? A promise is a promise. God is present, watching, and holding you account regardless. You're hopeless, you religion scholars and Pharisees, frauds. You keep meticulous counts of books, tithing on every nickel and dime you get, but on the meat of God's law, things like fairness and compassion and commitment, the absolute basics, you carelessly take it or leave it. Careful bookkeeping is commendable, but the basics are required. Do you have any idea how silly you look? Writing a life story that's wrong from start to finish, nitpicking over commas and semicolons. You're hopeless, you religion scholars and Pharisees. Are you still with me? I hope you are. This is the important part, you burnish the surface of your cups and bowls so they sparkle in the sun, while the insides are maggoty with your greed and gluttony. Stupid Pharisee, scour the insides and then the gleaming surface will mean something. You're hopeless, you religion scholars and Pharisees. You're like the manicured grave plots, grass clipped and the flowers bright, but 6 feet down it's nothing. It's all rotting bones and worm-eaten flesh. People look at you and think you're saints, but beneath the skin, you're total frauds. That's that's pretty intense words from Jesus. You can see Jesus is pretty worked up about this. He speaks about, whitewashed tombs with manicured grass, but dead 6 feet under, dead on the inside. Cups that are clean on the outside, but dirty on the inside. And as I was kind of reflecting on this and reflecting on my own hypocrisy in my own life, I thought to myself, I wonder if the Pharisees had just admitted their sin, their greed, their self-indulgence, as Jesus explained. I wonder if they'd done that, what Jesus' response would have been. And I think we can actually know what his response would have been because we've seen it throughout the rest of scriptures. We kind of know this because in other times in the Gospels, people who had sinned terribly came to Jesus. People who had stolen money, people who had been caught in the very act of adultery, people who had done far worse things and kept, careful book accounts. And we know how Jesus responded. Every time, Jesus welcomed them and he forgave them and he offered grace to them. To Matthew, the tax collector, who'd been stealing from his own people for years, he said, follow me. To the woman caught in adultery, he said, where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you? And when she responds no, he says, well, neither do I. Now, of course, he also tells her, go and sin no more. He's not condoning sin. But the point is, Jesus was always gracious to those who'd sinned, who'd messed up, who hadn't got it right. But why so harsh? Why not so with the Pharisees? Well, because of this thing called hypocrisy. See, I'm convinced the reason Jesus got so mad at these guys time and time again was not because their cups were dirty on the inside, but rather because they claimed their cups were clean. The sin is not so much the dirt and the stuff they're dealing with on the inside. It's the claim that there is no dirt. It's the sin of self-righteousness, which, from what I gather from Jesus' words, not just in this passage, but throughout the Gospels, was that was almost worse than the dirt itself. I mean, if I get up on Sunday and tell you, as a pastor, I get up on the stage and I say, hey, I've got this perfect marriage and we're doing so well and you must honor your wife and I honor my wife and treat her well just like I do. But then I go home and, our whole marriage is just shouting at each other and disrespecting each other. I mean, that's not cool, right? I mean, that would be upsetting to you and to those who call the church home. But if I said, hey guys, Jess and I, we actually really struggle sometimes with our own anger, and sometimes we shout at each other, and we're working on it, and we're seeing a counselor, and that's very different, isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't be mad at me that I'm doing it if I was open and honest about it. Now, of course, disrespect and allowing anger to hurt people is not good, but when we hide it, when we pretend like it's all good and we got it all together, that only makes things worse. It's not the dirt inside, it's the claim that we're clean that's the problem. Jesus can work with the dirt in the inside, with the greed, with the anger, with the lust, with all of that stuff, if we're open and honest about it, if we bring it to Him, if we come to Him, if we own our sin and our stuff and confess it to Him and to others. But when we hide, when we blame, when we pretend, when we point fingers at others like the Pharisees, well, then we find ourselves in a religious and a hypocritical spiral. Like whitewashed tombs with neatly clipped grass, but 6 feet under death and decay. Now, this is kind of challenging. I know for me it's super challenging, because we all have elements of hypocrisy in our lives. But what I've realized is that the antidote to hypocrisy is humility. The antidote to hypocrisy is humility, transparency, integrity between our beliefs and our actions, what we say and what we do, what we say we believe and how that plays out. The antidote is humility with confession and apology when we fail or when we're inconsistent. The Pharisees, you see, of Jesus' time, the problem was they saw themselves as more important than others, especially the kind of people that Jesus so often associated with. In Luke 11, this passage is repeated from Matthew chapter 23, where he uses the idea of dirty on the outside, dirty on the inside, clean on the outside, and he kind of chastises the Pharisees. But in that particular context, Jesus says this at a dinner party, where the Pharisees had decided to seat themselves at the most important place at the table, and they were looking down at the other guests. And so Jesus points out to his hosts, the Pharisees, that their elevated position in society and their demeaning position to those around them is not how God sees the world. And so today, for each and every single one of us, I think Jesus is inviting us to set aside our hypocrisy, our ideas of self-importance, and our inability to see our own faults. And rather, He's inviting us to see ourselves as others and as God sees us, as imperfect people who are perfectly loved. He's inviting us to authenticity. He's inviting us to live humble lives. And that, I believe, is the antidote to hypocrisy. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of 10 with Tom. I hope these short little kind of messages are helpful to you. Won't you like, subscribe, and share if this has been helpful, and we'll see you next time.